The fever came to Belmont Plantation like a thief in August of 1862, stealing breath and life with equal measure. It started in the quarters, as such things always did, but within a fortnight it had claimed the master's youngest son, two of his daughters, and finally the master himself. Sarah watched from the window of the kitchen house as the last wagon rolled down the oak-lined drive, packed high with furniture, silver, and the remaining family members fleeing north to relatives in Maryland. She was 23 years old, and she had just witnessed her enslavers abandon their grand estate in their panic to escape both the fever and the approaching Union Army that everyone said was marching through Virginia. They had taken most of the enslaved people with them, the healthy ones, the valuable ones, those who could still work and be sold if necessary. But Sarah had been in the sick house for 3 days when the evacuation began, burning with fever, and in the haste and fear of contagion, they had left her behind. She stood now in the empty kitchen, weak and hollow, staring at the remaining provisions they hadn't bothered to pack. A half-barrel of flour, some dried beans, a few jars of preserves, and whatever vegetables remained in the garden. The Carringtons had owned Belmont for 3 generations, worked by the labor of over 60 enslaved people at its height. Now, it stood silent except for the wind moving through the empty quarters and the main house. Sarah had been born on this plantation. Her mother had died here when Sarah was 12, worked to death in the fields. Her father had been sold away when she was 7. She barely remembered his face. She had no family left, no one who would come looking for her, no one who would even know she was here. The first night alone, she slept in the kitchen house where she had worked for the past 6 years, listening to the sounds of the empty plantation. The second day, she ventured into the main house, something she had never dared to do beyond the specific rooms she was permitted to clean. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. In the library, books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Thousands of words she couldn't read, kept by law from learning. In the parlor, a single chair remained, too heavy to be worth the trouble of moving. She found the master's study and saw the maps on the wall. One showed Virginia, with Belmont marked in ink. She traced her finger along the roads, wondering which way led to freedom, which way the Union Army might come from. But she had no way to know. The symbols and words on the map were meaningless to her. Another tool of power she had been systematically denied. She wandered through rooms she had never been allowed to enter. The master's bedroom, with its 4-poster bed draped in mosquito netting. The daughters' rooms, still scattered with the belongings they hadn't been able to pack. Ribbons, hair combs, half-finished needlework. One room, she found a diary lying open on a writing desk. The elegant script was beautiful to look at, even if she couldn't decipher its meaning. She wondered what secrets it contained, what complaints and dreams the young mistress had confided to those pages. Had she ever written about Sarah, about any of the people she had owned? The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking. Sarah was standing in the master's study, her hand resting on his massive oak desk, when it truly hit her. They were gone, all of them. The people who had owned her, controlled her, dictated every moment of her existence from sunrise to sunset. They were gone. She could stand in this room, she could sit in this chair, she could sleep in this bed if she wanted to. There was no one to punish her, no one to tell her no. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. By the 3rd day, Sarah realized the truth of her situation with crystalline clarity. She was alone, miles from the nearest town, too weak from her recent illness to walk far, and with winter approaching in a matter of months. She was free, technically. Her enslavers had fled, abandoning their claim. But freedom without resources, without strength, without knowledge of where to go or what to do was its own kind of prison. It was a cage made not of iron bars, but of ignorance, isolation, and scarcity. She had two choices: die here or find a way to survive. Sarah chose to survive. The first thing she did was take inventory. She moved through the plantation methodically, room by room, building by building, cataloguing everything that remained. The Carringtons had taken the valuables, but left behind the mundane: dishes, pots, blankets, tools, seeds. She found things she had never been allowed to touch: a set of carving knives in the kitchen, still sharp, icon pots of various sizes, a butter churn, wooden buckets and barrels. In the barn, she found the oldest mule, too lame to be worth bringing on the journey. The poor creature looked at her with mournful eyes, ribs showing through his dull coat. She named him Ulysses on impulse, after a name she'd heard the master use for some military man. In the tool shed, she discovered hoes, rakes, shovels, and other implements she'd seen used in the fields, but had never been permitted to wield herself. Kitchen slaves weren't taught field work. The smokehouse still held a treasure: several hams hanging from the rafters, along with slabs of bacon. They had been there long enough that some showed signs of spoilage around the edges, but much of the meat was still good, preserved by salt and smoke. The root cellar held a better supply than she'd initially hoped: potatoes, turnips, onions, and even some apples wrapped in paper to keep them fresh. She found a ledger book in the kitchen house, the cook's record of provisions and meals, and repurposed it. Using a piece of charcoal, she began making marks to track her supplies. She couldn't write words, but she could make notches, draw pictures of food items, count. 1 ham, 4 slabs of bacon, approximately 40 potatoes, 20 turnips. She estimated she had enough food for perhaps 2 months if she was careful, 3 if she was extraordinarily frugal and supplemented with whatever she could forage or trap. After that, she would need to have found a solution, or she would starve. The calculation was simple and brutal, and she faced it without flinching. Mathematics didn't care about hope or fear. It only dealt in quantities and time. The garden became her first project. It was late in the season, but there was still time to plant fall crops: turnips, collards, cabbage. She had worked in the kitchen for years, preparing food but never growing it. That was field work. But she had watched, she had listened, and necessity proved to be an excellent teacher. She worked the soil with tools from the barn, her hands blistering and bleeding. Every evening, she collapsed onto a corn husk, mattress in the kitchen house, muscles screaming. But slowly, green shoots began to appear in neat rows. The nights were the hardest. In the darkness, the plantation seemed to whisper with ghosts. She thought of her mother, her father, all the people who had lived and died on this land. She thought of the ones who had been taken away in the wagon, not knowing what fate awaited them with the Carringtons in Maryland. Sometimes she woke from nightmares, convinced she heard the overseer's voice, the crack of the whip. It would take minutes for her heart to slow, for her to remember. She was alone. There was no overseer. There was no master. She was alone. As September turned to October, Sarah established routines. She rose with the sun and checked the garden. She fed the old mule, whom she had named Ulysses, though she wasn't sure why. She foraged in the woods for nuts, mushrooms, berries, and edible plants. Knowledge passed down from her mother before she died. She set snares for rabbits and learned through trial and error how to skin and cook them. She found the plantation ledgers in the master's study and spent evenings staring at the symbols on the pages, wishing desperately that she could decode them. She knew her name was in there somewhere, recorded as property, with a monetary value attached. She knew the names of everyone who had ever been bought or sold through Belmont were inscribed in those pages. But they might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all she could understand them. One afternoon in late October, she heard voices on the road. Her heart seized with terror. She ran to the window and saw them. 3 men, rough-looking, with rifles. Deserters, perhaps, or worse, slave catchers, though she didn't know if such men were still operating with the war raging. She hid in the cellar, breathing shallowly, listening to them ransack the main house. They took whatever they wanted. She could hear furniture being broken, glass shattering. After what felt like hours, they left, their voices fading down the road. When she emerged, trembling, she found the main house in worse disarray than before. But they hadn't found her, and they hadn't found the cellar with her winter provisions. She had survived another danger. That night, she moved her sleeping quarters to the cellar. It was colder, darker, but safer. She could hide there if anyone else came. And she knew, with certainty now, that others would come. The South was tearing itself apart, and abandoned plantations like Belmont would draw all manner of desperate people. The first snow came in late November, earlier than usual. Sarah watched from the cellar entrance as white flakes drifted down, covering the frozen garden, the empty quarters, the silent main house. Belmont looked like a painting under the snow, beautiful and dead. The oak trees that lined the drive stood bare and skeletal, their branches black against the white sky. She had prepared as best she could. The root cellar was full of vegetables from the garden, turnips, potatoes, onions, cabbage, carrots. She had managed to grow more than she'd initially hoped, working the soil until her hands were permanently calloused and scarred. She had smoked and salted what meat she could get from trapping, mostly rabbits and squirrels, though once, miraculously, she'd caught a wild turkey. She had gathered every blanket, every piece of warm clothing she could find, even taking items from the main house that she would have been whipped for touching months earlier. The old mule, Ulysses, was sheltered in the barn, with enough hay to last through winter, though the supply was tighter than she would have liked. But preparation could only go so far. The cold seeped into the cellar, into her bones, with a persistence that no amount of clothing could fully defeat. She rationed her firewood carefully, allowing herself only small fires for cooking, and on the coldest nights when she feared she might freeze to death in her sleep, even then she limited the fires to a few hours at most. She wore layers of clothing, 3 dresses at once, 2 shawls, wool stockings, even a pair of the master's old boots stuffed with rags to make them fit. She slept under piles of blankets, quilts, and even old curtains pulled from the main house. And still she shivered through the dark hours, her teeth chattering, her muscles cramped from staying curled in a ball to preserve heat. The isolation was worse than the cold, more insidious, more corrosive to the spirit. Days would pass where she spoke to no one but Ulysses, and the mule was not much of a conversationalist, though she had long, one-sided discussions with him about everything from the weather to her memories of her mother. She talked to herself, sang the songs her mother had taught her, recited every prayer and story and snippet of overheard conversation she could remember, anything to keep her mind from folding in on itself, from surrendering to the silence and emptiness. She marked the passage of time with scratches on a wooden beam, one mark for each day. Watching those marks accumulate became almost ritualistic. Each new scratch was proof that she had survived another day, that she was still here, still alive, still enduring. Some days, when the hunger and cold were particularly bad, making that scratch was the only thing she accomplished, the only victory she could claim. In December, a group of Confederate deserters used Belmont as a camp for 3 days. Sarah hid in a concealed corner of the cellar, behind barrels and crates, barely breathing as boots stomped overhead. She heard them complain about the war, about officers, about hunger and cold. When they finally moved on, they had burned some of the outbuildings for warmth and slaughtered several chickens that had gone feral since the plantation was abandoned. In January, Union soldiers came through. Sarah debated whether to reveal herself. These were the men everyone had said were coming to free the enslaved. But they were also an army, and she had heard stories of what armies did. She watched from a crack in the cellar door as they searched the property. They were more methodical than the deserters, taking what they needed but not destroying for the sake of destruction. One soldier, a young man with a kind face, stood in the snow, looking at the empty slave quarters for a long time, shaking his head slowly. After they left, Sarah found they had taken most of the remaining chickens and a significant portion of her stored food. She sat on the cellar steps and calculated. She had perhaps 6 weeks of food left, if she was very careful. It was only mid-January. Spring was at least 2 months away. That night, for the first time since the Carringtons had fled, Sarah allowed herself to cry, great racking sobs that shook her thin frame. She cried for her mother, for her father, for all the years of her life stolen from her. She cried for the injustice of finally being free, but having that freedom mean only the freedom to starve slowly. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was hollow and empty as the mansion above her. Then she dried her eyes, pulled the blankets around her, and began to plan. By early February, Sarah was eating 1 small meal a day. She moved slowly to conserve energy, stayed in the cellar to preserve warmth, and spent hours in a half-sleep state. That wasn't quite rest, but wasn't quite consciousness either. The turnips ran out. Then the potatoes. She was down to dried beans and the last of the salted meat, which had begun to spoil despite her best efforts. Ulysses was suffering too. The hay was nearly gone, and the old mule was skin and bones. On February 14th, she marked the days with scratches on a cellar beam. Sarah made a decision. She would have to leave Belmont. Staying meant certain death, but leaving meant walking into the unknown, weak and half-starved, in the dead of winter. She didn't know which road led to Union lines, which towns might welcome a freed slave, or if she would survive even the first day of travel. She spent 2 days preparing. She packed what little food remained into a sack, along with a knife, a tinderbox, a warm shawl, and a canteen. She would take Ulysses. The mule couldn't carry her in his condition, but he could carry her supplies, and the company would be worth something. The night before she planned to leave, she heard it, a sound she had almost forgotten. Singing. Voices, human voices, singing a spiritual she knew from her childhood. Wade in the water, children. Sarah scrambled up from the cellar, her heart pounding. The moon was bright, and in its light she saw them, a group of about 15 people making their way down the road toward Belmont. Men, women, children, all of them black, all of them moving with the careful caution of people who had been hunted. They were refugees. She realized people who had fled other plantations, maybe heading toward Union lines, maybe just running. She ran toward them, stumbling in her weakness, and they scattered in fear until she called out, "Please, I mean no harm. I'm alone here." They gathered around her cautiously. Their leader was an older man named Josiah, who had escaped from a plantation 30 miles south. With him were his wife, 3 of their children, and 11 others they had picked up along the way. They were all starving, all desperate. Sarah made a choice in that moment. She told them about Belmont, about the cellar, the barn, the small amount of food that remained. "It's not much," she said, "but it's shelter, and together maybe we can survive until spring." They moved into the empty quarters that night, lighting fires in the hearths that had been cold for months. Sarah shared what little food she had, knowing it meant her own supplies would last perhaps another week. But looking at the faces around the fires, the mothers with their children, the old and young alike, she knew she had made the right choice. With 50 new souls at Belmont, everything changed. Josiah was a skilled carpenter and began repairing the quarters, making them more weatherproof. His wife, Martha, knew how to make food stretch in ways Sarah had never imagined. A young man named Thomas was an expert hunter and immediately set out to trap and forage with more success than Sarah had managed alone. An elderly woman named Celia knew herbs and medicine, and she began treating the sick among them. But they were still starving. The food Sarah had hoarded, even combined with what the newcomers had brought, would feed the group for perhaps 10 days. It was a boy named Marcus, no more than 12, who had the idea. "The master's house at Tanoa's house," he said. "We ain't looked everywhere. Rich folks always got hiding places." They searched the mansion from top to bottom with new purpose. Behind a panel in the master's bedroom, they found a cache of gold coins, the Carringtons' emergency money, forgotten or left behind. In a sealed jar in the attic, they found seed money, actual seeds of various vegetables carefully preserved. In the library, Thomas found a book titled The Practical Gardener, with illustrations clear enough that even those who couldn't read could follow. But the greatest discovery came from the cellar itself. Sarah had been living there for months, but with fresh eyes helping to search, they found a second room she had missed, hidden behind a false wall. Inside were barrels of wheat flour, preserved fruits, and smoked hams, a secret store the master had kept even from his own family. With this food, they could make it to spring, and with spring they could plant using the seeds they'd found. The gold coins could be used to buy supplies if someone was brave enough to venture to town. Josiah and Sarah made the trip to the nearest town in early March. It was a dangerous journey. Freed slaves were not always welcomed, and some were even captured and returned to servitude despite the changing laws. But with careful planning and Josiah's confident bearing, they made it to town, bought seeds, tools, and salt, and returned without incident. The town had news. The war was turning against the Confederacy. Union armies were pushing deeper into Virginia. Lee's forces were in retreat. Freedom, real freedom, was coming. When the spring thaw came, Belmont Plantation hummed with life for the first time in nearly a year. The refugees-turned-community plowed the fields and planted crops. corn, beans, squash, tobacco, enough to feed themselves and potentially sell. Children who had known only slavery now played freely in fields that had once been instruments of their bondage. Women who had been field hands under the lash now worked the same land as free women, singing as they planted. Sarah walked through it all with a sense of wonder. She had survived. Against every odd, every expectation, every rational calculation, she had survived the abandonment, the winter, the loneliness, and the hunger. And in surviving, she had created something new. A community of free people working land together, sharing labor and harvest. In April, Union soldiers came through again. This time, Sarah met them openly. She told them the story of Belmont, how the Carringtons had fled, how she had been left behind, how others had joined her. The officer in charge, a Captain Morrison from Pennsylvania, listened with growing amazement. "Mom," he said, "do you realize what you've done here? You've established a successful freed community on abandoned Confederate property. This is exactly what the government is hoping to see." He asked if he could write about Belmont, about Sarah's story. She agreed, though she couldn't quite understand why it would matter to anyone beyond these gates. But it did matter. Captain Morrison's report made its way up the chain of command and eventually to a journalist embedded with the Union Army. The journalist, a man named Edward Hutchinson, came to Belmont in May to interview Sarah and the others. He stayed for 3 days, watching the community work, listening to their stories. Sarah told him everything: the fever, the abandonment, the long winter alone, the decision to share with others, the collective survival. The other residents shared their own stories of escape, of hardship, of hope. Hutchinson's article appeared in the New York Tribune in June of 1863. He titled it, "The Last Soul of Belmont: How One Woman's Will to Survive Became a Beacon of Freedom." The article described Sarah's ordeal in vivid detail: the months of isolation, the near starvation, the terror of hiding from deserters and soldiers. But more than that, it described what Belmont had become: a thriving community of formerly enslaved people successfully farming land together, creating their own economy, their own society, their own version of freedom. The response was overwhelming. Northern newspapers reprinted the story. Abolitionists cited it as evidence of what freed slaves could achieve when given the opportunity. Churches organized collections to send supplies to Belmont. The Freedmen's Bureau, newly established, sent representatives to study what the community had created. Sarah's name became known across the North. She received letters from people she would never meet, expressing admiration, offering support, seeking advice. A group of women in Boston sent money to establish a school at Belmont. A freed black man who had taught himself to read in secret before escaping to the North traveled to Belmont to become the community's first teacher. By autumn of 1863, Belmont had transformed entirely. The old slave quarters had been rebuilt and expanded. New homes dotted the property. The fields were lush with crops. The community had grown to nearly 40 people, and more arrived each week, drawn by the stories of what had been achieved there. In October of 1863, a familiar carriage appeared on the road to Belmont. Sarah was in the fields when someone called out that visitors were approaching. She walked to the main road, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun, and her breath caught. It was the Carringtons, or what remained of them. Mrs. Carrington, now a widow. The master had died of the same fever that had nearly killed Sarah. two of her surviving children, both daughters, now young women. They stepped from the carriage and stared at the transformed plantation with expressions of shock. "Sarah," Mrs. Carrington said, recognizing her. "You're alive?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "I survived." Mrs. Carrington looked around at the thriving community, the cultivated fields, the rebuilt structures. When we left, we thought everyone had died of the fever. We thought the plantation would be abandoned." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, sharp and hot. "You thought. You didn't know. You didn't check. You just left me to die." "We were fleeing for our lives," one of the daughters protested. "Mother was terrified." "And I wasn't." Sarah's voice cracked. "I was sick, abandoned, alone. I was terrified every single day. But I survived. We all survived." Mrs. Carrington had the grace to look ashamed. "We've come to reclaim the property," she said softly. "The war is ending. We have papers showing our ownership." "Papers from a government that no longer exists," Josiah said, stepping forward. He had come to stand beside Sarah. "Papers that claimed ownership of human beings. Those papers don't mean much anymore." The Freedmen's Bureau representative, who had been staying at Belmont, approached. "Mrs. Carrington, under the Confiscation Acts and the recent Emancipation Proclamation, abandoned plantation property can be redistributed to freed slaves who have improved and worked the land. The community here has a strong legal claim to Belmont." What followed was a negotiation that lasted weeks. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Carringtons retained technical ownership of a portion of the land and the main house, but the community was granted legal right to work and profit from the majority of the acreage. The Carringtons, in truth, had little choice. Their resources were depleted, and they could not work the land themselves. More importantly, Mrs. Carrington made a public acknowledgement of what had happened. In front of the entire community, she apologized to Sarah for abandoning her, for the years of enslavement, for all the harm done. It wasn't enough, no apology could be, but it was something. By 1865, when the war finally ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the nation, Belmont Community, as it was now known, had become one of the most successful freed settlements in Virginia. The original 40 residents had grown to over 100. They had established a school, aka church, a cooperative store, and a system of shared land ownership that ensured everyone had a stake in the community's success. Sarah, at 26, found herself in a position she had never imagined, a leader, a voice, a symbol. People sought her advice on establishing other freed communities. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress about the needs of formerly enslaved people. She learned to read, hungrily devouring every book she could find. But more than the public role, what mattered to her was the daily life of Belmont. She loved walking through the fields in the morning, seeing children run to school, children who would grow up free, who would never know the weight of chains. She loved the Sunday gatherings where the community came together, singing the same spirituals that had sustained them through slavery, but now singing them as free people. She had found Thomas, the young hunter who had joined that winter, to be a man of quiet strength and gentle humor. They married in the spring of 1866 in the church the community had built together. Their first child, a daughter, was born in 1867. They named her Hope. The journalists still came occasionally, wanting to update the story of the last soul of Belmont. Sarah accommodated them, but found their fascination somewhat baffling. To her, she had simply done what needed to be done. She had survived. Others had survived. Together, they had built something new from the ruins of something terrible.